Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm sure that you guys have had a great day so far. I'm so happy to be a part of about 10 and a half minutes of it. I am the resident nonfiction writer of this unholy trinity, and I'd like to talk just a little bit about research. Do we have nonfiction writers in the bunch? Sometimes we're kind of, oh, wonderful. How many of you actually write poetry and fiction, but you've just tried nonfiction once or twice, and now you feel like you're nonfiction writers? Ah, ha, ha. All right, that's fine. This is for you, too. I'm going to talk about, I like to call the kind of work that I do the literary essay, which is probably pretentious, but in thinking about not journalism and not like a Chilton manual, thinking about nonfiction as a literary act and how we can sort of inject research into it. The work that I do, I write personal essays, I write pop culture pieces, I write essays about the natural world. And once we finish this talk, hopefully I'm going to go home and finish this essay that I'm working on right now about Jurcis Rhinoceros. Have you ever seen that? It's 500 years old this year, that woodcut of the rhinoceros. I've been working on it for way too long, and it's taken me to places where I've researched the history of tapestry weaving, apocalyptic perspectives in Renaissance culture, the living habits of the Indian rhinoceros, and trade routes to Portugal, among a whole bunch of other things. I had no idea that I'd be looking up when I saw this picture of Jurcis Rhinoceros and was like, I think I can do something with this. I had no clue. And so I guess what I'm going to talk about today is how writers like myself and like many of you can use research to enhance the creative potential in your work. Note that I said creative potential. I think there's often this sort of stigma attached to research in my genre that it's like tertiary or leaden or the thing that you have to do to make sure that you're still telling the truth, you know, so that the Oprah doesn't come after you or whatever. But it's this kind of, it takes this back seat to the imaginative work that we as creative writers do, right? That's why we have creative in front of our genre name, nonfiction, which is a whole nother 75-minute panel that I'll be doing on the street after this. But, you know, I've never found that backseat philosophy to be the case with nonfiction. For me, research is the engine. It's the tool that I use to get my imagination going and to keep it running. Research for me is very much a creative act. For me, it is the ultimate creative act. And I'm going to just try to, like, pull you guys into like my belief and be on team research in the next 6 minutes and 48 seconds. Now, what do I mean when I say research, by the way? I'm talking about any kind of process of looking for documented content outside of the self. So that's articles, that's books, that's interviews, that's items of art or popular culture. In some cases, it's guided travel, right? Bill Bryson, Appalachia book with Clint Eastwood or whatever. What's that called? A Walk in the Woods, right? Archival footage, documents, immersion, etc. Anything that introduces to your text a kind of external accountability. That's what I mean when I say research. So I like to think, because nonfiction is such a broad genre, right? You got your memoirists, you got your literary journalists, you have your lyric essayists, you have your moonlighting fiction writers, this big, big umbrella that we all have to stand under. I think one of the only things that we really have in common is that all of our pieces, all of our highly functioning pieces, are a cocktail of 4 major elements: scene, right? Commentary, form, and research. And once again, even in the nonfiction world, I feel like research is sort of kind of this backseat thing. But what I'd like to sort of prove is that those first 3 things, those more kind of major components of a great nonfiction essay, they can benefit creatively from research just as much as they could just benefit from kind of unresearched or imaginative work. Let's start with scene, okay? This is the most obvious of the 3, I think. Research can help any prose writer with world creation, right? Like there's nothing better than figuring out the name of the streetcar that maybe Louis Armstrong took when he went to be the king in his first Mardi Gras, and putting that in there. There's something about that sort of elevates your storytelling and gives it a lovely kind of crunch. Nonfiction, we're often dealing with a lot of different scenes, a lot of different stories. Some of them need to be a paragraph long. Some of them are a gorgeous chapter sliding into an entire book. So when I'm setting a scene, I read period magazines. I love looking at ads. I look at maps. I watch films. I find novels written in that time, listening for dialogue, hoping that it will sort of infect my narrative drive. And the whole time, I'm looking for three things. I'm looking for details, right? Nothing beats a great detail, a perfect detail that can nail a scene in a single phrase. And so I'm always hunting for that. I look for jargon, because we are all clannish individuals. And if you're writing about a scene that has people in it, chances are those people have their own way of talking about or looking at the world. So I'm always looking for those. And perhaps most importantly, I use research to look for boundaries, because if there's one thing that helps in world creation, it's learning what the world isn't, right? I don't know if you guys ever read Atonement, the Ian McEwan book, but at the very end, she takes this novel that she's written and the novel that the Bryony character has written, she goes to, it's about a time, it was about the war, and she didn't really do much in the war. And so she takes it to a fact checker and says that we didn't say on the double then, we said at the double, right? Like that kind of limitation. Or like if you're writing a scene from your past and you can go on weather.com or something and figure out that it was snowing that day, then those boundaries of what the world looks like, what the sun looks like, what the light looks like, all of a sudden tells you very much what you shouldn't be telling in a story as much as what you should. Here's an example from nonfiction. There's a great nonfiction writer named Matthew Gavin Frank. He's a poet as well. He had a book recently come out called Preparing the Ghost about searching for the giant squid. And he's got a book coming out this month called The Mad Feast. 50 short essays, each one covering a dish that's popular in each of the 50 states. So for my home state of South Carolina, he writes about chicken purlieu. And so he needs to do this quick world creation because it's like a cookbook-sized book with this recipe in it. The scene work that he has to do has to be rapid and it has to be exact. And South Carolina has to look a hell of a lot different than North Carolina and Georgia, or else, I have him on speed dial. When you look through this book, which I hope you get when it comes out, you look at the sort of the details and the small things that he figured out about road signs, about names of streets, about fabric, right? Depending on what he's talking about. He's got this great essay about DuPont and fabric for the Delaware essay. It's all there in these just little bits, and your hat is off to him creatively for making that kind of world. Okay, so now let's talk about how research can influence form. When I say form, I basically mean how the text is rendered on the page in a way that helps discuss or fuel the content of the piece, right? So the most traditional form in prose is, of course, a series of independent clauses separated by punctuation, gathered into paragraphs, moving down the page from top to bottom that we read from left to right. But as we all know, nowadays, people are taking a lot of really fun formal leaps in both poetry, prose, and it's sort of creeping into nonfiction a little bit. And I think research can help us really ground our formal experiments in interesting ways. So, your basic form would be like Bill Bryson. Your crazy form would be like Jenny Booley, who has an entire essay that's written in the footnotes. So there's like this beautiful white piece of paper, and then at the bottom, the whole essay happens in footnotes, right? Finding a form that can do that kind of experimental work is something that your research task can do. It breaks up the narrative, it signals a shift in thought, and it brings the visual representation of whatever outside accountability you're involved with into the piece. So let's say, for example, you just really want to talk about a film that you watched when you were young and your memoir, a scene and what happened, rather than sort of doing your traditional formal, and then I sat down and this is what appeared on the screen, and you move your typewriter ribbon over. Incorporating screenplay, the formal screenplay and the sort of run of the directions and the who said what, you could even change your font to that final draft, right? That's a way of bringing that artifact onto the page. A very extreme example of that is this really interesting nonfiction writer named Ander Monson, who got kicked out of private school for doing some kind of really early cybercrime. But it was this kind of stuffy private school, and he told the entire story in the shape of a Harvard outline. So he researched how to do a Harvard outline. It's something that you had to do back in the 70s and 80s when you were in high school, and you probably never had to do again. The rules, as you get farther and farther to the right of the page, become more and more sort of Byzantine. And you, as a reader, get to see this entire essay unfold from the tight cage of this form. It's spectacular. Look at, I don't remember what it's called, but you could research that. Okay. Moving on to the third sort of plank in the nonfiction cocktail, my favorite one other than research, commentary. How can we use research to bolster the role of commentary in our nonfiction work, right? When we're just talking about what we think, what we feel, how we move through the world, when we're assessing, when we're essaying, if I may use that verb, how can research help? I see that it can help in two ways. One is connecting the personal to the global. Many of us nonfiction writers are very interested in telling our stories. We don't want to write a biography of Amy Schumer, although maybe we do. Lainey apparently wants to read one. Is that right? Yeah, I would read that too. She should probably get a little older though. Anyway, we want to tell our stories, right? And then the major wall that we hit once we get started telling those stories, not all of us, but some of us, is who the F is going to care about this, right? Why does it matter that when I went to school, I got a B- in AP English, you know, or why does it even matter that my parents got divorced or whatever? There's something about incorporating a research text into that exploration. You have this impulse to write personally, but you're a little nervous or unsure of sort of the heft of that work. Bringing a peripheral text of someone that we all know or understand, the life of a saint, the life of a frog, right? Annie Dillard, the life of, or some kind of biological process, some kind of historical event that we all understand, an episode from a television program that we all know very well, and running it alongside whatever work you're doing, telling that story. It lets the reader know that the world is very much a part of your thought and that they are very much a part of your thought process, of your commentary. An example of this might be Son of a Gun by Justin St. Germain. Has anybody read this? Yeah, right? It's bomb-ass, right? He sold a book based on something that happened to him, the murder of his mother. 50 pages, I think, is what he sent for the proposal. They were like, Random House was like, here you go, write your book. And then about halfway through, he was like, I'm done with this. I'm done talking about myself and my feelings. And he then began this kind of exploration of the gunfight at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, and what that says about American masculinity and American violence. It's just this train track of commentary, of researched, deep, interesting commentary. He goes to gun shows. He lived near the OK Corral. He goes back to the OK Corral. He searches for the gun that killed his mother. And it's just bolsters the book in a way that I think allows it to just sort of shoot into the stratosphere. The second and final way that I think commentary can really be bolstered by research is, again, thinking about the self, not necessarily only about the self, but mostly about the self, difficult to express subject matter. Sometimes things are too big to talk about. I'm not saying that you shouldn't try, right? We should all try, but sometimes they're just huge, right? Having a baby, getting stood up on prom night, right? The Michael Jackson song, Billie Jean. It's done too much for us to talk about it. And that's when you get sometimes in your early drafts sentences like, words cannot describe the way I felt when I saw the space shuttle, you know, take off, or it was an inexpressible joy that came over me when my daughter opened her eyes. And it's like, if words can't express it, then what are you writing about it for? Like, this is not like interpretive dance nonfiction. Like, if you could press a button and start dancing your feelings at that point, and maybe technology will make that happen sometime soon. But right now, sorry, we don't have that at our disposal. So you can't do that. But if you really do have a problem sort of digging into some kind of emotional content or sort of gigantic content, that's another example of where research can come in. Sometimes talking about something else with the fervor and the intent of talking about the thing that happened to you or the thing that you love, the piece of pop culture that you love, opens up the discourse, opens up the commentary. I have a really savvy student right now down at Oregon State, and she got dumped. I mean, she got dumped hardcore. And we are recording this, aren't we? Sorry, Verity. And she also loves the ocean. Those are two equally gigantic things that are really hard to talk about, right? Like Matthew Arnold kind of covered the beach a long time ago, right? And so she was sort of stuck with these kind of empty, vapid, inexpressible sentences. And then all of a sudden, she found out that Charles Darwin had a semi-nervous breakdown and took the waters in like Geneva or something and just sat in the ocean water, and it cured him of his hysteria. And while this was happening, he became obsessed with barnacles. So you have this creature that's clinging to this other creature, sort of desperate to not let go, right? And then you have this genius who's having these emotional feelings, writing about them, keeping diaries about them, and also obsessed with the ocean. And so whenever things get a little too heavy or too much, she sort of just veers over into that world, and the barnacle does the work of the lover. It's really nicely done. I hope she keeps working on it. Okay. So those are, for me, how the big three things of the scene, form, research, commentary, cocktail can be influenced by research. And there's two more things that I'd like to say that research can do for our nonfiction projects. One is sort of micro and one is macro. For the micro, I think research should be used as a syntactical tool, right? We're still writers, even though we're writing about research content. We think about rhythm, music, space. Sometimes we just have a joke that we need to drop, and we know we need just a little bit more time to sort of vamp before the bump. You know, items of research have syllables, right? There's beautiful phrases and language. Why would you say atelier instead of weaver for somebody who makes a tapestry, right? Use atelier, right? So you can use just little bits of research, fun little sort of Google trips to sort of bolster your sentences. Like, for example, I wrote an essay on Frank Sinatra once. The first sentence that I wrote was, Frank Sinatra was a very spoiled child. After a little bit more researching, I was able to get a sentence like this. Not that it's a great sentence, but at least it's got some more content in it. He was the rare child of the 1920s who had not only his own bedroom, but his very own Atwater, Kent, right? So we have a year, we have a space, world creation, and we have a great name of a radio. I mean, iPhone does not hold a candle to Atwater, Kent, right? I had to write a kind of appreciation of James Gandolfini, because my first book is about the human voice. I had no idea what to do, so I said I'd write about James Gandolfini's amazing voice. And the first sentence that I wrote was, Gandolfini had a dialect coach for the show, The Sopranos, which I was astounded by, since he's from around there, right? Horrible sentence. After a little bit of researching, I was able to say, he had a dialect coach for the show, which astounded me since Park Ridge, New Jersey can't be that far from Essex County. So that's just a quick trip around, basic general internet sites to get those two lovely place names as a barbell for just kind of an articulation of my astonishment. I'll skip the last one because I think I'm kind of taking up a little too much time. Finally, for the macro effect. And if I could leave you with one thing, this is what I want to leave you with. Research, I feel like, should never be an end point for a nonfiction writer. I think we just heard, I think because of research papers when we were kids, where you go to your second grade teacher and go, I'm going to write an essay about tigers. And then you check out all the books on tigers, and you put tigers at the top of the page, and you're done, and everything about it has to do with tigers. I don't think that's the way that creative nonfiction people should practice research. The metaphor that I use is, I went to Yellowstone with my boyfriend last year, and we are not outdoorsy people, but we saw this sign by one of these Yellowstone canyons that said, Point Sublime, 2.0 miles. And I was like, oh, we can hike 2.0 miles, right? We could do it. And we sort of like chugged a whole bunch of water. And then we kept on walking, but because it's a hilly thing, it's not like a sidewalk, we didn't know what 2.0 miles was in the woods. I know that's a sin to say in the Pacific Northwest, but whatever, we're not from here. And and we were like, is this Point Sublime, right? And we just, this vista would show up with this like hawk, like flying, and like wind and a rainbow, and then there was no sign that said Point Sublime, so we would just keep on going. And then all of a sudden we would see this beautiful waterfall and like a chipmunk fighting a squirrel and like rocks and a rock slide. And then, no, that's not Point Sublime. And we would keep walking, blah, 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 blah. Long story short, too late. And then finally we got to this like railroad tie with like a pretty good, like a nice valley, right? But you could even see, because the railroad tie, and this old ass sign that said Point Sublime. And it was like, wah, wah. That is what using research in nonfiction is all about. You start out saying, let me get to Point Sublime. This is what our trip is. Let's chug this water. But the essay that you end up creating is all these weird little stops that you find along the way. Never have an endpoint in mind. always just pretend that that's where you're going to go and take notes at all those little vistas with the chipmunk fighting the squirrel and whatnot. Thank you very much.